Hello, well, welcome, and thank you for coming out today. I'm Walter Lohman, Director of the Asian Studies Center here at the Heritage Foundation. I know you're all here to see Tony Abbott, former Prime Minister of Australia. As you know, he was Prime Minister 2013 to 2015 and leader of the Liberal Party in Australia for a little bit longer than that, since 2009. That's liberal in the good sense of the word here at the Heritage Foundation, the Conservative Party in Australia. All in all, he was 25 years in Parliament, representing Warringah district on the outskirts of Sydney, up until just last year. But besides all of his bio, I think the most important thing about Tony Abbott is that he's a good friend of the Heritage Foundation. I have to say, as you look across the spectrum of political figures in Australia, there's hardly one we agree with more than we do Tony Abbott. Now, I don't know if that helps you in Australia. That might handicap you a little bit to be so closely associated with us, but I have to say, every time you come here and talk, you give us sort of a new sense of priority. You reinforce our principles here, and you rededicate us to the U.S. leadership position in the Indo-Pacific and our support for the U.S.-Australia relationship. And I know some of your comments are going to get to those issues, those international issues, but I also know that you'll be perfectly willing and able and competent to address a whole range of things that may be on people's minds. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Tony, and get us started.
Well, Walter, thank you, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here. It's always good to be in Washington. It's always good to be at the Heritage Foundation in particular. I have a speech which I'm going to deliver, and I've worked on it, so I think it's important that I do give you the speech that I've written. But let me just begin by saying that America is the indispensable country, the only country on earth with the strength and the goodwill to consistently lead the free world. And I like to think that Australia is America's indispensable partner, the one country that America can always rely on for help when America needs it. So with those introductory notes, it's great to be here at the Heritage Foundation. Now, back in November of 2014, when Australia hosted the annual meeting of the G20, it was by far the most important gathering of leaders ever held in my country, and it should have been a diplomatic triumph. But for President Obama choosing at that time to give a speech at the University of Queensland, that was seen as an attack on my government's climate policy. At the time, there was pressure for me to rebuke him for discourtesy, but I chose not to, because it was the duty, I thought, of the Australian Prime Minister not to be critical of the leader of the free world. Now, I have to say that on this trip to Washington, I've noticed that respect for the office of the President is not so common, even here in the United States itself. And that's a pity, if I may say so, because he's not just your President. As the leader of the free world, which the President inevitably is by virtue of America's singular strength and goodwill, in a sense, he's everyone's president. And the world needs him to succeed almost as much as America does. If the President is strong, America is strong. And if America is strong, Australia is stronger, Britain is stronger, Canada is stronger. Indeed, all the countries of the free world are stronger. And that's why so many people outside of the United States follow each president's triumphs and travails almost as closely as if we were ourselves citizens of this great republic. And much to the surprise of many, given the dismay that greeted President Donald Trump's election, indeed somewhat to my own surprise, given my view then that Mr. Trump was almost uniquely underqualified for such an office, I think he's been quite a success. His style, sometimes greats, but he has been a very good president. Maybe it's just been overtaken by Trump derangement syndrome, but for the first time in years, the main narrative is not one of American decline. For Obama, America couldn't be the world's policeman on its own and couldn't be the world's economic locomotive on its own. So it's refreshing, actually, that Trump doesn't talk about what America can't do, but what it can. Thanks to tax cuts and less red tape, American economic growth has surged. Employment has soared, especially for minorities. The stock market is hitting all-time highs and wages are finally increasing fast after decades of stagnation. Sure, Trump has shown more interest in boosting growth than in restraining spending, to the dismay of fiscal conservatives. But as Ronald Reagan might have said, for the moment at least, the deficit seems to be big enough and ugly enough to take care of itself. For years now, it's been assumed that America's destiny was to be overtaken by China as the world's largest economy. And of course, that may still happen. But actually, it's China's economy that now seems under pressure in the face of robust American efforts to stop China taking advantage of the free trade that it never practices itself. The people who know China best, the rich Chinese who can't wait to get their money out and their kids educated in the West, and the people of Hong Kong who are risking bloody repression in support of their British heritage, don't trust the goodwill or the longevity of the communist regime. For years, it's been assumed that globalisation, underpinned by freer trade, was both unstoppable and unambiguously good, even though it was much more obviously good for the rich people of poor countries than for the poor people of rich ones. Yet Trump's tariff hikes against China seem to be bringing more investment dollars home, boosting American manufacturing jobs and cutting the trade deficit while shrinking China's role in America's supply chains should cut the technology theft. For years, it's been assumed that the price of American global leadership was putting up with unreasonable critics and free-riding friends. It was joining global agreements that were against America's best interests, and it was turning the other cheek every time an enemy took advantage of American decency. That's how it was, but that's not how it is under Trump. Storming out of meetings is a rough way to make a point, but in refusing to be polite and to play by the old rules, Trump has actually improved America's position. He's called China a trade thief that was destroying American jobs. Mexico, the open back door that would have to pay for a wall. NATO allies, freeloaders who needed to get serious about their own defence. And the Paris Climate Change Agreement, a con, shackling America in ways that didn't bind other countries. It's been crude, but effective. And whatever you think of Trump's personal integrity, he's turned out to have had remarkable political integrity. He's done everything that he promised to do, including things that other presidents promised but never delivered, like moving the US Embassy to Jerusalem. He promised to cut taxes, and he has. He promised to boost the armed forces, and he has. He promised to pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and he has. He promised to pull out of Paris, and he has. He promised to appoint Conservatives to the courts, and he did. He promised to build a wall, and he has, at least to the extent that Congress would let him. He promised to bring China to book on trade, and he's certainly made a very strong start. He promised to pull America out of the endless wars of the Middle East. And with far fewer US soldiers killed on his watch, America is liked no less, but feared much more. Above all else, he promised to make America great again. And I think he's largely succeeding, fundamentally because his main instincts are sound, and supreme self-confidence means that he's never afraid of acting upon them. First and foremost, Trump is an American patriot. America made him, so he loves his country as he loves himself. Now, inevitably, there have been some questionable calls. Pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership was one, if only because for once it enabled China, with its rival free trade deal, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, to look more like a credible global leader than America. Pulling out of Syria could have been an abandonment of the Kurds, who had been America's most reliable Muslim allies in the Middle East. But he more or less reversed that decision 36 hours later, and one lot of American forces streamed in, just as another was streaming out. And then there was the drone killing of Iran's top general. Now, in my view, it was an error not to respond more vigorously to Iran's downing of an American drone, seizure of Western oil tankers, and attack on Saudi oil refineries. But then it might have been hard to respond proportionately to strikes that had made America look weak but had no actual casualties. But once Iran and its proxies had directly attacked Americans, Trump did what no one expected. He killed the very spearhead of Iran's attempts to export its Islamic revolution. Now, this could still have dire consequences, yet unmistakably it shows that you don't mess with America. Now, that might not be a recipe for success on Main Street, Middle America, but as we know, in the Middle East, gentle people are taken advantage of while fierce ones are left alone. And there's a world of difference between a fight with Iran that Trump is obviously ready to pick and a war in Iran that Trump shows not the slightest inclination to wage. Between attacking Iranian facilities and preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon that America could well be up for, and a ground invasion trying to bring about regime change that should really be the business of the Iranian people. Now, unarticulated perhaps, but real enough, there is emerging a Trump doctrine to use American economic strength against obnoxious regimes and to use military force to avenge any attack. To the Trump haters, the Soleimani killing was more evidence of wild oscillation between isolationism and interventionism, but more likely it just shows Trump's determination to hurt America's enemies, but not to add to America's responsibilities. From afar, it does, let's be fair dinkum, it does seem unpresidential to threaten other countries with hellfire, and personal to mock political foes as Pocahontas and Sleepy Joe. But maybe this political rally name-calling is just a modern American version of the verbal battles that are routine in other countries' parliaments. And sure, it's unprecedented for the leader of the free world in a situation where words can be weapons to compulsively tweet against anything he doesn't like. On the other hand, given officialdom's tendency to fudge, maybe an unfiltered president is exactly what the world needs right now. With a new Tsar in Russia, a new Sultan in Istanbul, as well as a new emperor in Beijing, and more great power jockeying than for many years, perhaps it is just as well that there's another Rough Rider in the White House. Even though Russian and Turkish meddling in Syria and Libya won't turn out any better for them than it has for Western powers, and China won't be strengthened by accumulating client states in the third world any more than other countries have. And why shouldn't America use first its economic strength with its military muscle in reserve in order to bring about its geopolitical objectives? What matters is that America and other Western countries should renovate their economies, rally their people, believe more in themselves, and act where they need to, always weighing what will do more good than harm in order to protect their citizens, to defend their interests, and to advance their values. And in America, and in Britain, and in Australia, this is happening. As Prime Minister, it was my view that it was presumptuous of a Western country like Australia to demand that other countries be just like us. In the Middle East, for instance, the most we could expect and demand was governments that didn't practice genocide against their own people, nor permit terrorism against ours. In other words, punish bad behaviour, reward good behaviour, and work with anyone where it's in our interests to do so. In my time, Australia flew military jets through China's self-proclaimed air defence identification zone, yet worked with China as we led the search for missing aircraft MH370. We did deals with our three largest trading partners to give us more like the same access to their markets that they had to ours. We were determined to bring back our dead from the MH17 atrocity, peacefully if possible, but forcefully if necessary. We joined the fight against the death cult caliphate, but on the understanding that we couldn't do more for the Iraqis than they were ready to do for themselves. And while we worked with the Indonesian government to stop people smuggling, when they failed to prevent illegal would-be migrant boats from leaving their country for ours, well, we turned them round and we sent them back. And while I never thought that the prospect of a slightly warmer climate in some decades' time was the world's biggest threat, never thought that, I was prepared to sign up to emissions reductions targets in Paris, provided other countries did likewise, and on the advice that cuts could be achieved without loss of jobs and without new taxes. And, as Prime Minister, I tried to make it easier for President Obama by ensuring that Australia was always there to help. Now, I'm not sure whether these policies were liberal interventionist, neoconservative triumphalist or pragmatic realist, and frankly, I never really cared for tags anyway, provided the result was a stronger Australia and a better world. Now, it's said with Trump that you should take him seriously, but not literally. But actually, I believe there is a pattern to it. He talks loudly to make a point, but talks softly when he's carrying a big stick, when he's taken out a general, for instance, or forced a trade concession. And sometimes he makes speeches that stand comparison even with Reagan's. His recent speech to the United Nations, for instance, was a paean to patriotism over globalism and to decent values over ideology. He was highly critical of some governments, but respectful of countries and generous to peoples and to cultures. If you want freedom, he said, take pride in your country. And if you want democracy, he said, hold on to your sovereignty. You see, Trump is the first major leader in the Western world to have worked out that poorer people have become more conservative, just as richer people have become more progressive, and to have recast centre-right politics around a country we can take pride in and a community we have a place in, as well as an economy we can make the most of. At least in the English-speaking countries, centre-right politics has never been very ideological or even especially philosophical. It's been about coming to grips with the troubles of the time in ways that correspond with people's best instincts. In the Eisenhower-Macmillan era, it was spreading prosperity through home ownership and higher wages. In the Reagan-Thatcher era, it was more economic dynamism through lower taxes and less regulation. And now in the Trump-Johnson era, it's still that, but with an added stress on pride in country at a time when so many of our citizens feel that everyone's interests come first but their own. You see, at the heart of the centre-right project has been care for those who are working hard but not necessarily getting ahead. The forgotten people, my party's founder, Bob Menzies, called them. They're the people of the flyover states for Trump and the Brexiteers for Boris Johnson, just as they were once the Reagan Democrats or the blue-collar Tories. A lifetime of pitching to the public seems to have given Trump an instinctive feel for what I'd call social fabric conservatism. And unlike the left, where what matters is subscribing to politically correct beliefs, for the centre-right, what matters is attending to people's real concerns. Trump's people cheered draining the swamp because the Washington class, like the Canberra bubble and the Westminster clique, the establishment, if you like, on both sides, had become more concerned with who was in power than with what was actually being done with it. Politics had become an insider's game, detached from the voters and their concerns. But now, Trump is their man running the government, not Washington's man running them. Who would have thought 4 years ago that the reality TV capitalist addicted to tweeting would turn out to be a more effective president than the political insider who'd preceded him, blessed with soaring rhetoric and symbolising the country's ability to heal? That's what the impeachment-obsessed sore losers who dominate the Democrat Party still don't get. So yes, everywhere our politics is becoming more fragmented and more polarised. The right is more right and the left is more left, and there's a tendency to retreat into echo chambers. But all of us are still citizens of particular countries, and we still need the governments of our countries to succeed. So rather than demonise everyone we disagree with, isn't it better to give our leaders, for the time being, at least some grudging respect? 4 years back, had I been an American, I'd have been a reluctant Trump voter, but not now. He might sometimes seem crass or intemperate, but that doesn't mean that he's not the best possible president for America at this time. After all, when it comes to electing the president, people aren't choosing a saint or even a role model. They're seeking a leader. And the one thing you can't say of Trump is that he's been shy to lead. In my country, if you have a go, you deserve to get a go. And that's how I feel about the presidency right now, which I guess makes me a supporter of keeping America great, an overseas supporter of keeping America great. But let's face it, it is a great country, and all of us have a stake in keeping it that way.
Well, thank you very much. You know, one of the things I didn't say in introducing you, and I should have, is that you are a keen observer of American politics. I think you know American politics as well as any American. I should have mentioned that in the lead up. You know, I wanted to start, if I could, with a question that's more political and maybe more focused on Australia off the bat here. But, you know, for 10 or 15 years, if I think 10 or 15 years ago, the general take on the connection between conservatives here in the US and conservatives or liberals in Australia was that they're different. that in America, where economic conservatives, focused on economic freedom and the rest, but we have this social element. And in Australia, they don't have that. In some ways, I think here the impression was they're cooler in Australia. The conservatives are cool in Australia because they don't care about social issues. They just care about low taxes and all the rest. I wonder if you could tell us something about the way that conservatism in Australia is evolving, because it seems to have evolved substantially in the last 10, 15 years.
Okay, well, thanks, Walter. And look, I should offer this opening observation that conservatism is not an ideology, and I would be reluctant to even call it a philosophy. Conservatism is a state of mind as much as anything else. It's a set of instincts. Ultimately, it's respect for what is and a reluctance to change what works, other than where it's obvious that there is something that would be better. And invariably, that something which would be better is more of a restoration than a reform. It's going back to something which better suits these times than that which had perhaps corrupted what had well suited earlier times. So conservatism is certainly not a systematic philosophy based on a particular idea in the way that liberalism might be, or socialism might be, or communism might be. So that's the first point I'd make. Now, conservatism tends to be what people who regard themselves as conservatives think and do at any particular time. And the greatest contemporary conservative in Australia obviously was John Howard, our 25th Prime Minister, and the longest serving Prime Minister other than Bob Menzies, the founder of the Liberal Party. Now, Howard said that the essential position of the Liberal Party is to be economically liberal and socially conservative. What he meant by that was that we tended to support the market in economics, but we tended to be traditionalists when it came to other things. I think conservatism in Australia is no less conservative on social issues than it was. Not that we're always successful in defending traditional values, but I think it's becoming less liberal on economic issues. I think conservatism in the English-speaking world is becoming less liberal on economic issues. President Trump is not a free marketeer in the way that President Reagan was. Prime Minister Johnson is not a free marketeer in the way that Margaret Thatcher was. Neither Reagan nor Thatcher were uniformly market-oriented, but in those days, and let's face it, we were reacting against the statism of the 50s and 60s and the 70s, the sclerosis of the 70s in particular. In those days, there was a great deal of enthusiasm for markets. I think today, while we all accept that markets are the best engine of wealth generation, I think we also accept that wealth generation is not the only thing that we should be on about, and that the social fabric is incredibly important, as well as the wealth of our country. So this is a bit of a long-winded discourse, but nevertheless, Walter, I do think that conservatism takes on the temper of the times. You remember back in the days of the Clinton election, there was that phrase, the economy's stupid. I think these days the equivalent would be to say society stupid. We're more conscious of the importance of the bonds of solidarity today than we might have been 20 or 30 years ago.
That was terrific. Thank you. And now I wanted to turn to a question more international, and it gets right to the topic of your talk, what next after America? What is the answer to that question? What, if not America leading, especially in the Indo-Pacific, but globally, what other choice do we have?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I chose a topic and then I wrote a speech, and the speech didn't quite fit the topic. I'm sorry about that. I mean, that's what happens. You think, let's talk about something, and then as you start to think about it and write about it, you decide that there's actually something more interesting and more urgent, and so you go off in another direction. Look, there is no doubt that there are more challenges to American prestige and strength, economic and military, today than for quite a few decades. But the interesting thing is that under Trump, America doesn't appear to be daunted by those challenges in a way that I think it had been before Trump. I think post-Trump, well, we don't know what the post-Trump era will look like because we haven't got to that yet. But the singular feature of Donald Trump is that he has supreme self-confidence in himself and in his country. And that, frankly, was the missing ingredient in the previous presidency. And frankly, there has been a diffidence to the West for much of the post-war period. Our confidence waxed under Reagan and Thatcher. It waned under their successors. I think, again, it's starting to wax under people like Trump and Boris Johnson, and that's a good thing.
Great, thank you. I want to take some questions from the audience. There's quite a bit in the news. I'm sure there's questions out here. Yes, right here, the yellow shirt. Yes. Please identify yourself if you wouldn't mind and
Sure,
ask your question.
Ken Meyercord. You mentioned the free world a number of times. Is there an unfree world? And if so, what should Australia's relations be with it?
Well, obviously there are lots of important countries which don't enjoy freedom in the sense that we enjoy freedom in Britain, America, Australia and Western Europe. China's not a free country, as the people of Hong Kong are only too well aware. I don't think Turkey is becoming more democratic. I think it's plainly becoming less democratic. Russia seemed to have a period of anarchic freedom, but plainly that's not the case under President Putin. So yeah, there are lots of countries that don't enjoy the sort of freedom that we take for granted. I'm not saying that we shouldn't work with those countries. And certainly I was only too happy to work with China where it was in our mutual interests to do so. But I think it's also important to accept that if a country is not free, it's not free, and not to gloss over those differences. I think for a long time there was this rosy assumption on the part of many of us, myself included perhaps, that China and the West were on kind of converging paths, but I don't think anyone would say that that's the case now, and I think it's been obvious, at least for the last few years, that is not the case. So look, the world comprises some 190 different countries, big and small, similar and dissimilar, free and not free. And the important thing is for those of us that are free to do what we can to nudge the world in the right direction always accepting that it'll never be perfect, and we can easily end up doing more harm than good if we blunder into situations where angels would fear to tread.
The trickiest one of those is the Chinese, right? I mean, because China, as you say, is far from free, but it's essential to the Australian economy. What's the future of Australia's relationship with China, given that dynamic?
Okay, well, it's a good question, and there will be lots of senior business figures in Australia that would urge the Australian government to avoid doing anything that might upset the Chinese government, not for argument's sake to support American freedom of navigation exercises in the South China Sea, not to protest about what may be in the offing in Hong Kong, not to meet with the Dalai Lama and so on. Now, I certainly don't think that we should be gratuitously offensive to anyone. Certainly we shouldn't be gratuitously offensive to China, given its significance to us and to the wider world. But I think we've also got to appreciate that China doesn't do deals with us because it's benevolent. China doesn't trade with us because it's doing us a favour. China trades with us because we're a very good trading partner. It gets good products at a good price. And it would actually be against China's long-term self-interest. It would be cutting off its nose to spite its face if China were to change its trading patterns to try to punish Australia, for argument's sake, for being a reliable strategic partner of the United States. So, as always, these things are balancing acts, but in the end, you've got to have your own self-respect, and the last thing you should do is sell your soul for a short-term financial gain.
Yeah, I can say watching the debates in Australia from afar, that's a perspective that's sometimes lost, I think, in Australia. You talked a lot about confidence in the United States. Again, from afar, an outsider, sometimes it doesn't seem Australians have enough confidence in their own country and its assets and the value that it brings to the table when dealing with China. It's all China as the demandeur, and Australia as the respondent in those situations. Other questions right here, red dress.
Leah from Voice of America. In your speech, you talked about the phase one trade deal between the United States and China. You think President Trump has made a very strong start. I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit about the impact this phase one trade deal between US and China might have on Australia? That's one. The second question is, Australia is part of the Trump administration's Indo-Pacific strategy. From Australia's point of view, do you think this strategy has been effective in balancing China, if not containing China? Thank you.
Well, the first point to make, I suppose, is that it is absolutely in Australia's interests, and it is absolutely in the interests of the Indo-Pacific region that America retain a very strong involvement. I don't think there's any country in Asia other than China itself that wants America to quit its positions in the Indo-Pacific. So that's the first point to make. Second point to make is that there is absolutely no doubt that China has taken advantage of a globalised economy. And look, all credit to the Chinese people and government for the extraordinary advances in human well-being that have been the result. Lifting 500 million people from the third world to the middle class in just over a generation is one of the most remarkable, if not the most remarkable advance in material well-being in the whole of history. So all credit to the Chinese for this. But the fact remains, the Chinese system is very, very different from ours. A world dominated by China would be very different from the world we've known for the last century or so, and I think it would be a worse world in almost every respect. And the fact that Chinese people who can want to get their money out of China, want to get their kids educated in the West, want to see if they can acquire property in the West and passports of Western countries, says all you need to know about the real nature of the current Chinese government. Does this reflect badly on the Chinese people? Well, no, it doesn't, because if you look at Singapore, if you look at Taiwan, if you look at Hong Kong, if you look at the way Chinese people live in countries such as Australia and America, there is no kind of authoritarian gene in the Chinese people, as we have seen looking at Taiwan and Hong Kong and Chinese people who are living in countries like this. As for the Phase 1 trade deal, let's see how it works out. At the moment, it's really an aspiration. It's a commitment. It's not something that's been delivered upon. If China goes ahead and buys billions and billions more from the United States, that's all well and good. My suspicion is that that won't have a huge impact on Australia's exports. Our main exports to China are things like coal, iron ore, natural gas, and boutique foodstuffs. It seems to me that it's more commodity foodstuffs that America is going to be exporting to China, and I don't think Australia is in that market to the same extent.
Hi, Tony. Matt Knott from the Sydney Morning Herald newspaper. You would have seen that the bushfires in Australia are getting a lot of attention here. The front page of the papers here, and people here may not know you've been out fighting the fires on the front line. In many publications here, Australia is now being held up as kind of an example of what will happen if the world doesn't take action on reducing carbon emissions, as kind of a poster child for a lack of action on climate change. What's your reaction to that? And also, I was wondering if you think that the Prime Minister has his reaction to the fires, has he made any mistakes? He took the holiday to Hawaii when the fires was happening. Was that a mistake? What do you think of the way he's handled it?
Well, I don't think anyone could fault the extraordinary effort that the Prime Minister has put into responding to the current, or now I think starting to recede, bushfire emergency. In terms of money, in terms of time, and in terms of commitment of the armed forces, it's been quite unprecedented. So all credit to Scott Morrison for what he's done there. Now, just on the subject of climate change, look, I had if you like, a standard response whenever I was asked about climate change. I said, climate does change. Mankind does make a difference, and we should do what we reasonably can to limit emissions. Of course we should. We should rest lightly on the planet. But I would always say we shouldn't damage our economy in the pursuit of environmental objectives, particularly when it might turn out to be counterproductive. We all know that stronger economies are much better at managing the environment than weaker ones. You only have to look at the United States on the one hand and the countries of Africa on the other hand. So look, everything associated with an extreme weather event these days is taken as proof of climate change. Bushfires prove climate change, floods prove climate change, Superstorm Sandy, I think, that proved climate change, whether it's extraordinarily cold or extraordinarily hot, whether it's extraordinarily dry or extraordinarily wet, it all proves climate change, because if you think climate change is the most important thing, everything can be turned to proof. I think that to many, it has almost a religious aspect to it. I think the Prime Minister is right. He said that climate change may be playing a role in the drought which triggered the bushfires. But we've got to remember that bushfires are hardly unknown in Australia. And while the current bushfires are probably the worst that New South Wales has experienced, and the current bushfire season has been very extensive, the duration may be unprecedented. In terms of burning out large parts of the country, no, not unprecedented. In terms of death, no, not unprecedented. The Black Saturday bushfires in Victoria killed 173 people. The Ash Wednesday bushfires of 1983 killed 75 people. The 1974 fire season, that burned out more than 100 million hectares compared to about, I think, 6 million hectares so far this season. So look, I'm not one of those people who sees the current bushfires as a confirmation of all we've ever feared about the changing climate. I see the current bushfires as the sort of thing that we are always going to be prone to in a country such as ours, a land of droughts and flooding rains, as the poet said all those years back. That said, obviously we do have to take sensible measures to reduce emissions, and the great thing about Australia is that while we're not perhaps the most enthusiastic members of the climate squad, we are actually meeting our Paris targets in a way that very few other countries do. And I think we should get more credit for actually keeping our commitments when it comes to reducing emissions.
Yeah, right in the center here, purple.
Thank you very much for the wonderful speech. I'm Angel with Hong Kong Phoenix Television. And my question is, how is Australia going to balancing the Australia and China relationship, and at the same time as Australia and the US relationship? And do you see that China and Australia will keep deepening their relationship as trading partners in the future? What might affect them as like the largest trading partners right now? Thank you.
Okay, well look, John Howard had a way of putting it. He said Australia doesn't have to choose between our history and our geography. And I had my own way of putting it when I was Prime Minister. I said you don't make new friends by losing old ones. And I think it's more than possible for Australia to have an extremely intimate strategic partnership with the United States, while at the same time to have a strong and growing economic relationship with China. I think there are some things that China and Australia are always going to disagree about, as long as China remains a communist autocracy and Australia remains a liberal democracy. But that's life. People don't always agree. Countries don't always agree. The important thing is to manage the disagreements, and so far we've managed to do it well.
Thank you, Kitty. I'll come to you next.
Thank you, Kitty Wang with NTD TV. Yeah,
U.S. have this free, open Indo-Pacific strategy. So, from your point of view, what can U.S. and Australia do together more in this field to promote the values here?
Well, look, I think Australia and America are doing a lot, and I can't think of anything where we haven't done as much as is reasonably possible. So look, I think the important thing is for the United States to stay very closely engaged in the Indo-Pacific region. You might be hinting at what should the Western response to things like the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank be. And if you are, I think that we need to be careful about anything which creates a debt trap for other countries. And this plainly is a potential outcome of the sorts of measures that are happening under the so-called Belt and Road Initiative. Not good for the recipient, and in the long run, I suspect not good for the donor. The United States development aid, Australian development aid, is invariably directed to strengthening the recipient as opposed to establishing a relationship of dependency between the donor and the recipient. And I certainly don't think that in response to Belt and Road initiatives, we should engage in that kind of activity ourselves.
You know, maybe even a hotter topic than that is the issue of telecommunications technology and where Australia is going with that, where everyone is going with regard to 5G and Huawei, et cetera. Can you comment on that?
Well, look, the position of my government was that we didn't want to see Huawei deeply embedded in our telecommunications infrastructure. It was in fact a decision of the former Labor government, which my government maintained, to exclude Huawei from the national broadband network. It was a decision of the Turnbull government to exclude Huawei from our 5G telecommunications system, and I think that was a correct decision. I do think there are issues when, I mean, given that in China there is a degree of government involvement in business and a degree of government direction of business that is completely unknown in countries such as ours, I do think that we have to be very careful about too much involvement by China in strategic supply chains. And I think President Trump is very much alive to that. And I think that what we are seeing is some unbundling of those supply chains, at least in respect of America and China. And I don't think that's a bad thing.
Right here in the center, and I'm going to get a couple here because this will probably be the last round. Yes.
Gerald Chandler, could you just make some remarks about changing Australian attitudes toward immigration, reception of refugees, and republicanism?
And then down here with the blue shirt.
Hi, Tony. Do you share former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd's belief that China and the US can cooperate in a prolonged sense instead of just the temporary, as in they can exist, you know, the world order can exist together?
Anyone else? Okay. Yes, right here.
You talked about
Got a
America.
micro. Could you identify yourself, please?
Ann Pierce, I'm an author, especially in American foreign policy. You talked about America's singular strength and goodwill, which I agree with, but I feel that Americans recently have so much less goodwill toward each other, and I feel that there's this tendency to care less and less about people living um, in just horrible conditions with atrocity committing regimes, and less concern by Americans about the human rights of people around the world, and more sort of feeling sorry for ourselves, especially obviously on the left. But I wondered if you have a sense of Americans changing in that direction.
Thank you. So 3 questions and whatever else you'd like to wind up with here.
Okay, well, look, thank you. Immigration. Australia, like America, is an immigrant country. And the fact that people can come to Australia from anywhere in the world and build a great life for themselves and be first-class Australians adds, I think, a wonderful, humane and even heroic dimension to our country. So it's almost impossible to be an Australian and be anti-immigrant, but just because you're pro-immigrant doesn't mean that you necessarily support any particular level of immigration. And I think there are issues with current very high levels of immigration to Australia because at the record levels we've seen over the last decade or so, I think there is downward pressure on wages. I think there's upward pressure on housing prices. I think there's a lot of pressure on infrastructure. So I think you can certainly make a case for returning immigration levels more to the long-term average than they have been in the last decade or so. But look, that's not to be anti-immigrant. To be anti-immigrant, I think, is almost to be anti-Australian. On becoming a republic, well, look, America is a wonderful republic. Britain and other countries are wonderful constitutional monarchies, and I think that America's system of government is a product of America's history. Our system of government is a product of our history. You can't change the history, and you should be reluctant to change the system unless you are absolutely confident that the alternative is an improvement. And I don't think there are any problems in Australia that becoming a republic would fix. So feeling for the monarchy waxes and wanes. Obviously there's, I think, universal admiration and respect for the Queen. I think there's considerable enthusiasm for many other members of the royal family. From time to time, the human factor in all families is something that we might, I suppose, cheer or not, as the case may be. But in the end, it's the system, not the individuals, that we support. It's the office, not the office holder, that in the end counts. And I don't think that the sort of personal stuff that we've been reading about over the last few weeks is going to make any long-term difference to this wonderful institution. China and America, look, I think there's absolutely no doubt that we are in an era of great power competition. The question is, where does it lead? Now, we have to accept the fact that war between modern countries would be cataclysmic in a way that was have been. And so I think we just have to have faith in the good sense of the leaders of these countries to manage things effectively. The United States and the Soviet Union managed conflict and tension, not perfectly, but sufficiently well to avoid all-out war for 50-odd years, and I'm sure that the same thing can take place between the United States and China. And look, the last point that was raised, it's interesting, isn't it? There is a sense in which we have never been better off materially, and yet often we feel that we've rarely been worse off spiritually than we are now. This is quite a problem in the modern world, particularly in the modern West, and it expresses itself in so many different ways. There's a bad temper, a reluctance to accept good faith today, which is more pronounced than a generation ago. There's a tendency for our disagreements to be less and less civil, even in countries with a long tradition of civil discourse, such as ours. I really dislike the fact that these days, if you disagree with someone, they're not just mistaken or misguided, they're morally wrong. Because let's face it, no one has a monopoly on wisdom, no one has a monopoly on truth. There are few people and few arguments that we can't learn from in some way. So look, I share your dismay at aspects of our contemporary conversation, and all we can do is try in our own way to be uplifters rather than drag us down. It's not always easy, particularly in the heat of argument. We sometimes go too far and we impugn people's motives rather than simply criticising a particular position. Whenever that happens, I think we should do our best to make amends and resolve to lift our game. And probably most of us at the moment could lift our game.
Well, thank you so much for those remarks, Tony. I'm so glad we could work this out today and have you here. Thanks again. That's good.
Good on you, Walter. Thank you so
you
much,
too,
mate.
yeah.
Thank you.